You know that feeling when you're Paul McCartney and it's February 1995? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You're trying to make a second Beatles comeback single from some shabby old cassette tapes, but the ones Yoko Ono gave you were incredibly hard to work with. Still, it was nice of her to hand over anything at all, given the frosty nature of past relations. Or was it? What if this gesture of cooperation were really something different? Keep watching for a story of technical challenges, band infighting, and possible long-distance sabotage. In 1994, the three surviving Beatles reunited to try and make a new single out of an old Lennon cassette tape, and the results, Free as a Bird, were good enough that a year later they came back to attempt another song from the same batch. Like Free as a Bird, Real Love dates from Lennon's house husband years and was already known to bootleggers in various forms. An acoustic version had been released on the Imagine soundtrack in 1988. And there was a different song called Real Life, which had the same chorus, but some touching slice-of-life type verses. It sounds like with a bit of work, Real Life could have turned into a cynical Lennon twist on What a Wonderful World. Unfortunately, this light, airy croissant of a song was turned into a stodgy old bit of lard cake called Steppin' Out. People did tend to overproduce back then, sadly. Real Love, on the other hand, had a really nice piano intro, but otherwise not much else going for it. Ono had this to say about why she chose the song. The Beatles would be singing to the world again. The implication of that was tremendous. I thought it was a song which would release people from their sorrow of losing John. The song seemed mostly complete, but the Beatles did some editing to it. They halved the length of the pre-choruses, they wrote a guitar solo section. They also made an outro by copying and pasting every iteration of Lennon singing the title phrase. But besides that, they didn't really find much room to add to the song creatively. As a recording, Real Love was in much worse condition than Free as a Bird. There was a mains hum running through the entire thing, there was much more hiss, the vocal was quieter, and there was hundreds of clicks which took about a week to remove. After this was finished, they sped the track up slightly to try and give it more energy, which raised the pitch by about a semitone, and then the Beatles were ready to overdub, but with none of the sense of occasion that they'd had on Free as a Bird. But for some extra Beatle juice, they used the harmonium that had been on We Can Work It Out, and the Celesta that John had played on Because. Paul, once again, had to double John's vocal to try and give it a bit more presence. The result wasn't great. Free as a Bird had its problems, but this is just bad. The vocal sounds like it's coming off a scratched up old 78, and for some reason they gated around him so that every time he finishes a line his piano just disappears from the mix, which sounds ridiculous. Also, there's a clash between their attempt at this poppy up-tempo arrangement and the source material, which was a gentle performance of a gentle song. And their attempt to force the two things together by speeding Lennon's tape up just makes him sound like a chipmunk. It's a bad record. Some of the blame goes on the song, but I also feel some frustration with the Beatles too. They claim to cultivate an irreverent attitude towards John during this process, saying he wouldn't have stood for any mythologising of him. But they could have stood to be a bit more irreverent, I think. I mean, Paul actually said, great thing about Real Love was we were locked in with the demo. You couldn't really change it that much. And you just think, why? Why not write a new bridge, say, or replace some of his vocals with your own? Maybe write some better melodies in the process. Ultimately, it seems they tiptoed around the song too much. Free as a Bird became like a genuine Beatles collaboration, but this just remains a dodgy Lennon track with some very formulaic Beatle harmonies and guitar on it. Here's what they should have done. Make an absolutely slamming hardcore punk version that goes into this sick half-time breakdown. Why wasn't I consulted? But that all said, some of the blame for how bad this record is has to fall on Yoko Ono and her decision to secretly troll the Beatles rather than cooperate with them. So, before anyone gets the old jump to conclusions mat out, I'm not a Yoko broke up the Beatles type. I don't think John should have stayed with that nice Cynthia, and I think people who throw racist or misogynist abuse around are dicks. So, with that said, here's what I'm talking about. There's at least 3 piano demos of Real Love knocking about online. Take 1, take 4, and a mystery take which is identified by an extra bar of piano at the beginning. We know that none of these are the take the Beatles used because the lyrics don't match, but take 1 has a lot of hiss like what Jeff Lynne described.
Real Love, take 1.
It also has very quiet vocals. I think it's likely that that take is in the ballpark of what the Beatles were working with, and with the technology at the time, they stood no chance of making anything good with that. The other 2 takes have very little hiss.
Take 4.
Not only that, but they also both have nice, clear vocals.
All my little plans and schemes, all the little plans and schemes.
By handing over the tapes, Ono seemed, on one level, to be cooperating with the Beatles' Anthology project. But handing over such a dodgy recording when much better ones existed looks a lot like sabotage. And doesn't the fact that the far better Take 4 was issued by her a couple of years later on, wait for it, the John Lennon Anthology, look an awful lot like epic trolling? Nah, doesn't add up, does it? Look, I tried to find evidence of some great conspiracy to jazz the video up and I failed. Alright, are you happy? Fact is though, Lennon didn't leave much behind. And Ono giving them a slightly less crap version of one iffy song wasn't going to make much difference, was it? I did go through some of his other leftovers, playing that old game of what would a Beatle version of this one have sounded like, and I thought one cool possibility would have been the song Mr. Hyde's Gone, which has quite a similar feel to some of Paul's classic Beatles songs like Penny Lane, and Your Mother Should Know it has the sort of junk feel on the piano. So maybe having a Lennon Beatles song in that vein would have been a cool twist. But enough what-ifs, because there were actually 2 other Lennon songs that Ono gave them. There were supposed to be more than 2 reunion singles. So what happened? The other songs were called Now and Then and Grow Old With Me. Now and Then was worked on for a couple of days but then scrapped, with Harrison declaring it f***ing rubbish. Paul said the beginning bit's great and then it just goes a bit crummy, which is about right. There is also a nice bit at the end of the chorus. It's a shame though, because the good bits are much better than Real Love, but Paul said they didn't want to do a hatchet job on it. There's an odd contradiction here because they all said working on Free as a Bird was much more fun than working on Real Love because they had more room for input on it. So it's odd that they ditched a song that gave them even more room to do that. I kind of wish Paul had said to George, just let me go away and write a chorus and see what you think. Although he has threatened to go back to the tape and try and finish it, which would be interesting. Grow Old With Me was dismissed altogether. In an interview at the time, McCartney said, we're not that keen on that one. Although a version was later worked up by George Martin, who wrote some strings to it. Like with everything else by this time, the Beatles told a very bland, glossed-over narrative of their work together on this project. But so much had gone down between them over the years that the old tensions were never far away.
Paul had asked, had suggested maybe the chance of me and he writing together something. I've only been there about 30 years in Paul's life, and it's like now he wants to write with me.
There had been a plan to film the 3 of them playing Let It Be as a climax to the series, but George hated the idea, and there was an intense discussion about it that went on for 3 hours. We got that footage of them playing old rock and roll standards instead. The last day of editing on the series was one of the worst moments. It was the final episode covering the split. This was when they each found out what the others had had to say on camera about those events. Apparently things got very heated. McCartney told the Anthology team the next day that he wasn't sure they'd even get through it. Free as a Bird was released in December 1995 and reactions were mixed. Rock critic Grail Marcus said, "It's a grand tradition that's creepy whenever it occurs," referring to the use of recordings left behind by dead artists. "It's a grotesque idea that would bring out all of John's cynicism were he around." Beatles expert Mark Lewisohn called it absolutely wonderful. Cynthia Lennon also gave her view, saying, "My first impression was great disappointment. I strained to hear John. He sounded like he was in a broom cupboard, but the more I hear it, the more I love it." George Martin had an interesting take on things, saying, "The idea of having dead John with live Paul, Ringo and George didn't appeal to me. I might have done it if they'd asked me, but they didn't. To conceal the bad bits, they had to plaster it fairly heavily, so what you ended up with was a thick, homogeneous sound that hardly stops. There's not much dynamic in it." He went on to say that while they made John's tape the basis of the record, he would have taken a reverse approach, making the song the basis of the record, have the three of them record their version of it, and then find a place to drop John into it. I can't help wishing he'd have got the job. One thing the Beatles still did have, though, was perfect timing. This was the mid-90s, the height of Britpop, after the Fabs had spent most of the 70s and 80s out of fashion. Oasis were now the biggest band in the world, and there couldn't have been a better moment for a Zombie Beatles single to be released. Radio already being cluttered with their zombie offspring, which was maybe why, by the time Real Love came out, Radio 1 had had enough and refused to play it, saying, "It's not what our listeners want to hear. We are a contemporary music station." In other words, we want our knockoff 60s guitar music made by people born in the 70s. In 2015, remixes of the two reunion singles were released. There's surprisingly little information about them, but it's assumed they were done by Giles Martin and Jeff Lynne. Free as a Bird has a nicer bass sound, and Real Love now has piano that doesn't keep nipping out for a fag between lines, so that's good. Really though, there's no transforming these records until they get AI on the job, and you know that's coming. They'll make a Sonic Lennon hologram and have it re-sing both of them, and then they'll rustle up AI versions of the other band members, get them generating songs, and the Beatles can become the next thing ruined. Another exciting pop culture moment rebooted as furniture in our monotonous pop culture eternity. But some of you will pay money for it, ensuring it never ever stops. So, what's everyone's opinions? Is Real Love better than Free as a Bird? Is it worse? Should both records be sealed in concrete and dumped in the North Sea? You know where to go to hash that one out. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, click there. And remember, the ultimate secret to a happy life is always...